Necromancy and Naat by Clark Ashton Smith. Dead longing, sundered evermore from pain. How dim and sweet the shadow-hearted love, the happiness that perished lovers prove. In Naat, far beyond the sable main. Song of the Galley Slaves. Part 1. Yadar, prince of a nomad people in the half-desert region known as Zyra, had followed throughout many kingdoms a clue that was often more elusive than broken gossamer. For 13 moons he had sought Delili, his betrothed, whom the slave traders of Shah Rag, swift and cunning as desert falcons, had reft from the tribal encampment with 9 other maidens, while Yadar and his men were hunting the black gazelles of Zyra. Fierce was the grief of Yadar, and fiercer still his wrath, when he came back at eve to the ravaged tents. He had sworn then a great oath to find Delili, whether in a slave mart or brothel or harem, whether dead or living, whether tomorrow or after the lapse of grey years. Disguised as a rug merchant, with 4 of his men in like attire, and guided only by the gossip of bazaars, he had gone from capital to capital of the continent Zosik. One by one his followers had died of strange fevers or the hardships of the route. After much random wandering and pursuit of vain rumours, he had come alone to Oroth, a western seaport of the land of Xylak. There he heard a rumour that might concern Delili. For the people of Oroth were still gossiping about the departure of a rich galley bearing a lovely outland girl, answering to her description, who had been bought by the Emperor of Xylak and sent to the ruler of the far southern kingdom of Euros as a gift, concluding a treaty between these realms. Yadar, now hopeful of finding his beloved, took passage on a ship that was about to sail for Euros. The ship was a small merchant galley, laden with grain and wine, that was wont to coast up and down, hugging closely the winding western shores of Zothik and venturing never beyond eyesight of land. On a clear blue summer day it departed from Oroth with all auguries for a safe and tranquil voyage. But on the 3rd morn after leaving port, a tremendous wind blew suddenly from the low-lying shore they were then skirting, and with it, blotting the heavens and sea, there came a blackness, as of night, thickened with clouds. And the vessel was swept far out, going blindly with the blind tempest. After 2 days the wind fell from its ravening fury, and was soon no more than a vague whisper, and the skies cleared, leaving a bright azure vault from horizon to horizon. But nowhere was there any land visible, only a waste of waters that still roared and tossed turbulently without wind, pouring ever westward in a tide too swift and strong for the galley to stem. And the galley was borne on irresistibly by that strange current, even as by the hurricane. Yadar, who was the sole passenger, marvelled much at this thing, and he was struck by the pale terror on the faces of the captain and crew, and, looking again at the sea, he remarked a singular darkening of its waters, which assumed from moment to moment a hue as of old blood commingled with more and more of blackness, though above it the sun shone untarnished. So he made inquiry of the captain, a greybeard from Euros named Agor, who had sailed the ocean for 40 summers, and the captain answered, "This I had apprehended when the storm bore us westward, for we have fallen into the grip of that terrible ocean stream which mariners call the Black River. Evermore the stream surges and swiftens toward the place of the sun's outermost setting, till it pours at last from the world's rim. Between us now and that final verge, there is no land saving the evil land of Naat, which is called also the Isle of Necromancers. I know not which were the worse fate, to be wrecked on that infamous isle or hurled into space with the waters falling from earth's edge. From either place there is no return for living men such as we, and from the Isle of Naat none go forth except the ill sorcerers who people it, and the dead who are raised up and controlled by their sorcery. In magical ships that breast the Black River, the sorcerers sail at will to other strands, and beneath their necromancy, to fulfill their wicked errands, the dead men swim without pause for many nights and days, whithersoever the masters may send them. Yadar, who knew little of sorcerers and necromancy, was somewhat incredulous concerning these matters. But he saw that the blackening waters streamed always more wildly and torrentially towards the skyline, and verily there was small hope that the galley could regain its southward course, and he was troubled chiefly by the thought that he should never reach the kingdom of Euros, where he had dreamt to find Delili. All that day the vessel was borne on by the dark seas racing weirdly beneath an airless and immaculate heaven. It followed the orange sunset into a night filled with large, unquivering stars, and at length it was overtaken by the flying amber morn. But still there was no abating of the waters, and neither land nor cloud was discernible in the vastness about the galley. Yadar held little converse with Agor and the crew, after questioning them as to the reason of the ocean's blackness, which was a thing that no man understood. Despair was upon him, but, standing at the bulwark, he watched the sky and wave with an alertness born of his nomad life. Toward afternoon he descried far off a strange vessel with funereal purple sails that drove steadily on an eastering course against the mighty current. He called Agor's attention to the vessel, and Agor, with a muttering of sailors' oaths, told him that it was a ship belonging to the necromancers of Naat. Soon the purple sails were lost to vision. But a little later, Yadar perceived certain objects resembling human heads that passed in the high billowing water to the galley's leeward. Deeming that no mortal living men could swim thus, and remembering that which Agor had said concerning the dead swimmers who went forth from Naat, Yadar was aware of such trepidation as a brave man may feel in the presence of things beyond nature, and he did not speak of the matter, and seemingly the head-like objects were not noticed by his companions. Still the galley drove on, its oarsmen sitting idle at the oars and the captain standing listless beside the untended helm. Toward night, as the sun declined above that tumultuous ebon ocean, it seemed that a great bank of thundercloud arose from the west, long and low-lying at first, but surging rapidly skyward with the mountainous domes. Ever higher it loomed, revealing the menace as of piled cliffs and sombre, awful sea capes, but its form changed not in the fashion of clouds, and Yadar knew it at last for an island bulking far aloft in the long-rayed sunset. From it a shadow was thrown for leagues, darkening still more the sable waters, as if with the fall of untimely night. And in the shadow the foam crests flashing upon hidden reefs were white as the bared teeth of death. And Yadar needed not the shrill, frightened cries of his companions to tell him that this was the terrible Isle of Naat. Direly the current swiftened, raging as it raced onward for battle with the rock-fanged shore, and the voices of the mariners praying loudly to their gods were drowned by its clamour. Yadar, standing in the prow, gave only a silent prayer to the dim, fatal deity of his tribe, and his eyes searched the towering isle like those of a sea-flown hawk, seeing the bare, horrific crags and the spaces of dark forest creeping seaward between the crags, and the white mounting of monstrous breakers and a shadowy strand. Shrouded and ominous of bale was the island's aspect, and the heart of Yadar sank like a plummet in unsunned seas. As the galley hove nearer to land, he thought that he beheld people moving darkly, visible in the lapsing of surges on a low beach, and then hidden once more by foam and spindrift. Ere he saw them a second time, the galley was hurled with thunderous crashing and grinding on a reef buried beneath the torrent waters. The forepart of its prow and bottom were broken in, and being lifted from the reef by a second comber, it filled instantly and sank. Of those who had sailed from Oroth, Yadar alone leapt free ere its foundering, but since he was little skilled as a swimmer, he was drawn under quickly and was like to have drowned in the maelstroms of that evil sea. His senses left him, and in his brain, like a lost son returned from yesteryear, he beheld the face of Dalili. And with Dalili, in a bright phantasmagoria, there came the happy days that had been ere his bereavement. The visions passed, and he awoke struggling with the bitterness of the sea in his mouth, and its loudness in his ears, and its rushing darkness all about him. And, as his seizes quickened, he became aware of a form that swam close behind him, and arms that supported him amid the water. He lifted his head and saw dimly the pale neck and half-averted face of his rescuer, and the long, black hair that floated from wave to wave. Touching the body at his side, he knew it for that of a woman. Mazed, and wildered though he was by the sea's buffeting, a sense of something familiar stirred within him, and he thought that he had known somewhere, at some former time, a woman with like hair and similar curving of cheek. And, trying to remember, he touched the woman again and felt in his fingers a strange coldness from her naked body. Miraculous was the woman's strength and skill, for she rode easily the dreadful mounting and falling of the surges. Yadar, floating as in a cradle upon her arm, beheld the nearing shore from the billow's summits. And hardly it seemed that any swimmer, however able, could win alive through the wildness of that surf. Dizzily, at the last, they were hurled upward, as if the surf would fling them against the highest crag, but as if checked by some enchantment, the wave fell with a slow, lazy undulation, and Yadar and his rescuer, released by its ebbing, lay unhurt on a shelfy beach. Uttering no word, nor turning to look at Yadar, the woman rose to her feet, and beckoning him to follow, she moved away in the deathly blue dusk that had fallen upon Naat. Yadar, arising and following the woman, heard a strange and eerie chanting of voices above the sea's tumult, and saw a fire that burned weirdly with the colours of driftwood at some distance before him in the dusk. Straightly toward the fire and the voices, the woman walked, and Yadar, with eyes grown used to that doubtful twilight, saw that the fire blazed in the mouth of a low, sunken cleft between crags that overloomed the beach, and behind the fire, like tall, evilly posturing shadows, there stood the dark-clad figures of those who chanted. Now memory returned to him of that which the galley's captain had said regarding the necromancers of Naat and their practices. The very sound of that chanting, albeit in an unknown tongue, seemed to suspend the heartward flowing of his veins and to set the tomb's chillness in his marrow. And though he was little learned in such matters, the thought came to him that the words uttered were of sorcerous import and power. Going forward, the woman bowed low before the chanters like a slave, The men, who were 3 in number, continued their incantation without pausing. Gaunt as starved herons they were, and great of stature, with a common likeness, and their sunk eyes were visible only by red sparks reflected within them from the blaze, and their eyes, as they chanted, seemed to glare afar on the darkling sea, and on things hidden by dusk and distance. And Yadar, coming before them, was aware of swift horror and repugnance that made his gorge rise, as if he had encountered, in a place given to death, the powerful evil ripeness of corruption. High leaped the fire, with a writhing of tongues like blue and green serpents, coiling amid serpents of yellow. And the light flickered brightly on the face and breasts of that woman who had saved Yadar from the Black River, and he, beholding her closely, knew why she had stirred within him a dim remembrance, for she was none other than his lost love, Delili. Forgetting the presence of the dark chanters, he sprang forward to clasp his beloved, crying out her name in an agony of rapture. But she answered him not, and responded to his embrace only with a faint trembling. And Yadar, sorely perplexed and dismayed, was aware of the deathly coldness that crept into his fingers and smote through his very raiment from her flesh. Mortally pale and languid were the lips that he kissed, and it seemed that no breath emerged between them, nor was there any rising and falling of the wan bosom against his. In the wide, beautiful eyes that she turned to him, he found only a drowsy voidness, and such recognition as a sleeper gives, when but half awakened, relapsing quickly into slumber thereafter. "Art thou indeed Delili?" he said. And she answered somnolently, in a toneless, indistinct voice, "I am Delili." To Yadar, baffled by mystery, forlorn and aching, it was as if she had spoken from a land farther away than all the weary leagues of his search for her. Fearing to understand the change that had come upon her, he said tenderly, "Surely thou knowest me, for I am thy lover, the Prince Yadar, who has sought thee through half the kingdoms of earth and has sailed afar for thy sake on the unshored sea." And she replied like one bemused by some heavy drug, as if echoing his words without true comprehension, "Surely I know thee." And to Yadar there was no comfort in her reply, and his concernment was not allayed by the parrotings with which she answered and all his other loving speeches and queries. He knew not that the 3 chanters had ceased their incantation, and verily he had forgotten their presence. But as he stood holding the girl closely, the men came toward him, and one of them clutched his arm. And the man hailed him by name, and addressed him, though somewhat uncouthly, in a language spoken throughout many parts of Zothik, saying, "We bid thee welcome to the Isle of Naat." Yadar, feeling a dread suspicion, interrogated the man fiercely. "What manner of beings are ye? And why is Delili here, and what have ye done to her?" "I am Vachan, a necromancer," the man replied, "and these others with me are my sons, Vokal and Aldula, who are also necromancers. We dwell in a house behind the crags, and are attended by the drowned people that our sorcery has called up from the sea. Among our servants is this girl, Delili, together with the crew of that ship in which she sailed from Oroth. Like the vessel in which thou camest later, the ship was blown far a sea and was taken by the Black River and wrecked finally on the reefs of Naat. My sons and I, chanting that powerful formula which requires no use of circle or pentacle, summoned ashore the drowned company, even as we have now summoned the crew of that other vessel from which thou alone wert saved alive by the dead swimmer at our command." Vachan ended and stood peering into the dusk intently, and Yadar heard behind him a noise of slow footsteps coming upward across the shingle from the surf. Turning, he saw emerge from the livid twilight the old captain of that galley in which he had voyaged to Naat, and behind the captain were the sailors and oarsmen. With the paces of sleepwalkers they approached the firelight, the sea water dripping heavily from their raiment and hair and drooling from their mouths. Some were sorely bruised, and others came stumbling or dragging with limbs broken by the rocks on which the sea had flung them. And on their faces was the look of men who had suffered the doom of drowning. Stiffly, like automatons, they made obeisance to Vashon and his sons, acknowledging thus their thraldom to those who had called them from deep death. In their glassily staring eyes there was no recognition of Yadar, no awareness of outward things, and they spoke only in dull, rote-like recognition of certain obscure words addressed to them by the necromancers. To Yadar it was as if he too stood and moved like the living dead in a dark, hollow, half-conscious dream. Walk be the enchanters through a dim ravine that wound secretly toward the uplands of Naat. In his heart there was small joy at the finding of Deliili, and his love was companioned with a sick despair. Vachon lit the way with a brand of driftwood plucked from the fire. Anon a bloated moon rose red as with Sanae's mingled blood over the wild racing sea, and before its orb had cleared to a death-like paleness, they emerged from the gorge on a stony fell where stood the house of the three necromancers. The house was built of dark granite, with long, low wings that crouched amid the foliage of close-grown cypresses. Behind it a cliff beetled, and above the cliff were sombre slopes and ridges piled in the moonlight rising afar toward the mountainous centre of Naat. It seemed that the mansion was a place preempted by death, for no lights burned in its portals and windows, and a silence came from it to meet the stillness of the one heavens. But when the sorcerers neared the threshold, a word was spoken by Vakara, echoing distantly in the inner halls. And as if in answer, lamps glowed suddenly everywhere, filling the house with their monstrous yellow eyes, and people appeared instantly within the portals like bowing shadows. But the faces of these beings were blanched by the tomb's pallor, and some were mottled with green decay or marked by the tortuous gnawing of maggots. A dire suspicion sprang up in Yadar, and no longer could he eat the food and drink the wine of the necromancers. And he was puzzled by the actions of his hosts, who, abstaining likewise, turned in the chairs and peered steadily at a portion of the door behind Vashon, between the table and the hall's inner end. Yadar, rising a little in his seat, looked down across the table and perceived a small hole in one of the flagstones. The hole was such as might be inhabited by a small animal, but Yadar could not surmise the nature of a beast that burrowed in solid granite. In a loud, clear voice, Vashon spoke the single word, Ezrit, as if calling the name of one that he wished to summon. Not long thereafter, two little sparks of fire appeared in the darkness of the hole, and from it sprang a creature having somewhat the size and form of a weasel, but even longer and thinner. The creature's fur was a rusted black, and its paws were like tiny, hairless hands, and its beaded eyes of flaming yellow seemed to hold the malign wisdom and malevolence of a demon. Swiftly, with writhing movements that gave it the air of a furred serpent, it ran forward beneath the chair occupied by the cannibal and began to drink greedily the pool of blood that had dripped down on the floor from his wounds. Then, while horror fastened upon the heart of Yadar, it leapt to the cannibal's knees and thence to his left shoulder where the deepest wound had been inflicted. There the thing applied itself to the still bleeding cut, from which it sucked in the fashion of a weasel. The blood ceased to flow down on the man's body, and the man stirred not in his chair, but his eyes still widened, slowly, with a horrible glaring, till the ball were aisled in livid white, and his lips fell slackly apart, showing teeth that were strong and pointed, as those of a shark. The necromancers had resumed their eating, with eyes attentive on the small bloodthirsty monster, and it came to Yadar that this was the other guest expected by Vashan. Whether the thing was an actual weasel or a sorcerer's familiar he did not know, but anger followed upon his horror before the plight of the cannibal, and drawing a sword he had carried through all his travels, he sprang to his feet and would have tried to kill the monster. But Vashan described in the air a peculiar sign with his forefinger, and the prince's arm was suspended in mid-stroke, and his fingers became weak as those of a babe, and the sword fell from his hand, ringing loudly on the dais. Thereafter, as if by the unspoken will of Vachan, he was constrained to seat himself again at the table. Insatiable, it seemed, was the thirst of the weasel-like creature, for, after many minutes had gone by, it continued to suck the blood of the savage. From moment to moment the man's mighty thews became strangely shrunken, and the bones and taut sinews showed starkly beneath wrinkling folds of skin. His face was like the chapless face of death. His limbs were lean as those of an old mummy. But the thing that battened upon him had increased in size only so much as a stoat increases by sucking the blood of some farmyard fowl. By this token, Yadar knew that the thing was indeed a demon and was, no doubt, the familiar of Vachan. Entranced with terror, he sat regarding it, till the creature dropped from the dry bones and skin of the cannibal and ran with an evil writhing and slithering to its hole in the flagstone. Weird was the life that now began for Yadar in the house of the necromancers. Upon him there rested always the malign thraldom that had overpowered him during that first supper, and he moved one who could not wholly awake from some benumbing dream. It seemed that his volition was in some way controlled by those masters of the living dead, but more than this, he was held by the old enchantment of his love for Delili, though the love had now turned to a spell of despair. Something he learned of the necromancers and their mode of existence, though Vachan spoke seldom except with grim ironies, and the sons of Vachan were taciturn as the dead. He learned that the weasel-like familiar, whose name was Esrit, had undertaken to serve Vachan for a given term, receiving in guerdon, at the full of each moon, the blood of a living man chosen for redoubtable strength and valor. And it was clear to Yadar that, in default of some miracle or sorcery beyond that of the necromancers, his days of life were limited by the moon's period, for other than himself and the masters, there was no person in all that mansion who had not already passed through the bitter gates of death.